The hum of the main console was a familiar lullaby, a constant companion in the late hours I often kept. My sanctuary, the nerve center of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, thrummed with a low, constant energy, a symphony of whirring fans and soft indicator lights. Outside, the desert night was a velvet cloak, speckled with stars I sought to understand but rarely saw directly. My world was one of data streams, of faint whispers from across unimaginable distances, all funneled through the colossal dish that stood sentinel against the sky. I had been tracing faint gravitational lensing patterns, an almost meditative task, when the anomaly first flickered across the primary display. It wasn't a blip, not a transient spike of cosmic rays. It was a waveform, sharp and intricate, appearing on a channel that should have been silent, utterly, profoundly silent. This particular sector of the void, a vast gulf between two superclusters I'd informally dubbed the Great Emptiness, was known for its utter lack of anything interesting. No nascent star formation, no rogue planets, not even the faint, diffuse hydrogen clouds that usually peppered interstellar space. Just nothing. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the display. A frown creased my brow. This couldn't be right. I checked the telemetry, the dish alignment, the cryo-cooling systems for the receivers. All green, pristine, the kind of perfect operational status that usually meant a quiet night of predictable cosmic ballet. I ran a quick diagnostic on the optical fibers, then the quantum entanglement relays that processed the raw data. Everything reported nominal. Yet there it was again, a complex, almost deliberate pattern emerging from the static. My first thought, naturally, was equipment malfunction. A stray power surge, perhaps, or a glitch in the new generation Deep Space Observatory's cutting-edge processors. I'd seen weirder things from temperamental tech. I rerouted the signal through a secondary array, then a tertiary one, effectively isolating the potential fault. The waveform persisted, identical in every detail across all three independent processing chains. It was coming in clean, unfiltered, directly from the receivers. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, calling up filters, algorithms designed to sift through the universe's endless chatter. I tried to classify it. Pulsar? No, too irregular, too layered. Quasar flare? Not even close. The energy signature was too subtle, too contained. Gravitational wave ripple. The frequency was all wrong. It wasn't a burst, not a pulse, not the rhythmic beat of a known celestial object. This was an unfolding, a sequence that built upon itself, each new element seemingly informed by the last, yet never repeating. It defied every known astrophysical signature. A prickle of unease started to crawl up my spine. I tugged at the collar of my worn lab coat. This wasn't just noise, it was structured. Incredibly, impossibly structured. Like a language I couldn't comprehend, but whose complexity hinted at vast, unfathomable depths. And it was coming from the Great Emptiness, a region of space that should be a cosmic blank canvas. I spent the next hour running increasingly sophisticated analyses. I cross-referenced the signal against every known celestial catalog, every anomaly ever recorded. Nothing matched. Not even remotely. It was as if something was deliberately modulating its output to remain just below the threshold of blatant discovery, yet unmistakably present. My initial scientific dismissal began to fray, replaced by a growing, unwelcome curiosity. It wasn't just not random, it was anti-random. It possessed an internal logic that was alien to anything I had ever encountered in my years studying the cosmos. The patterns weren't repeating but evolving. Each iteration of the signal, lasting mere microseconds, added a new layer of complexity, a new fractal branch to an ever-growing, non-linear tree of information. The quiet solitude of the control room, usually my solace, began to feel like an echo chamber. The low hum of the machines, once a comfort, now felt like a prelude. I found myself checking the clock more often, glancing at the security feed that showed the empty corridors outside my console. The logical part of my brain screamed instrument error or unforeseen cosmic background phenomenon, but the other part, the part that had driven me to spend my life staring into the abyss, whispered something else entirely, something ancient and deliberate. My hands, usually steady as I manipulated delicate data, felt oddly clumsy. I knew with a certainty that defied reason that this wasn't just a glitch. This was an entity, a presence, and it was speaking. Or rather, it was unfolding itself, one intricate, non-repeating sequence at a time from a place where nothing should exist. I finally logged the event, meticulously detailing every parameter, every diagnostic run, every failed attempt at classification. My finger hovered over the discard button, the rational choice, the safe choice, but I couldn't do it. What was this thing? What was it trying to say? And why now from the deepest, most desolate pocket of the universe? My gaze drifted back to the screen, where the intricate waveform continued its silent, impossible dance, beckoning me into its incomprehensible depths. I had spent the night before just listening, letting the anomaly wash over me, a strange comfort in its sheer impossibility. Now the real work began. I settled into my chair, the worn leather creaking a protest, and pulled up the raw data stream. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up spectrographs and frequency analyzes. I expected noise, a chaotic jumble of static from some distant, mundane cosmic event, or perhaps even a calibration error. My initial scans had been cursory, just enough to confirm it wasn't a terrestrial interference. What I saw now, however, made my breath catch in my throat. The initial visual representation on the main screen was a bewildering tapestry of intricate, interwoven patterns. It wasn't the smooth, predictable curve of a pulsar, nor the broadband hiss of a quasar. It was sharp, deliberate, yet utterly alien in its structure. I zoomed in, then in again, pushing the processing power of the system. The patterns resolved into smaller, equally complex sub-patterns. It was like examining a snowflake under a microscope, only to find each ice crystal contained an entire fractal landscape within it. My mind, trained for years to find order in the universe's grand chaos, struggled to categorize this. There were no discernible harmonic series, no Doppler shifts indicating motion, no spectral lines to hint at composition. It was pure information, woven into a fabric of energy I couldn't identify, emanating from a void that should have been silent. My unease began to curdle into something colder. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, the kind I get when I realize I lay alone in a vast, empty space. The signal wasn't random. That much became terrifyingly clear as I ran correlation algorithms, comparing sections of the data stream. There were repetitions, yes, but not simple loops. They were variations on themes, like musical motifs evolving and intertwining. It was a language, I realized with a jolt that sent a tremor through my hands, but a language without a dictionary, a grammar, or even an alphabet I could recognize. I spent the next 48 hours in a blur, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the increasingly unsettling rhythm of the signal. The outside world faded. My phone, buzzing occasionally with calls from a colleague, went unanswered. Food became an afterthought, a mechanical necessity. My world shrank to the glowing screens and the incomprehensible data unfolding before me. I barely noticed the ache in my shoulders or the dryness in my eyes. All that mattered was dissecting this impossible thing. The patterns weren't just complex, they were meaningful. I found what seemed like nested hierarchies, layers upon layers of structured information. It wasn't just organized, it was designed. Every fiber of my scientific training screamed that this was impossible. Natural phenomena didn't produce this kind of deliberate, non-random complexity without a source, without a physical explanation. It wasn't like a radio wave that carried information. It was the information, somehow existing as pure concept, pure intelligence, without the need for a carrier wave, without a medium. It transcended what I understood about communication, about physics, about reality itself. I tried to isolate snippets, to find a Rosetta Stone within its alien syntax. I ran every known algorithm, every theoretical framework. Nothing. The signal laughed at my attempts, remaining a perfect, impenetrable enigma. It was like trying to understand a symphony by analyzing the individual air molecules that carried the sound. The underlying structure was there, undeniable, but the meaning remained just out of reach, a phantom limb of understanding. The air in the installation began to feel heavier, charged with an invisible pressure. Was it just my sleep deprivation, my mind playing tricks? Or was the signal itself beginning to subtly alter my perception of my surroundings? I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, a vague sense of being observed settling over me. The low hum of the servers, once a comfort, now seemed to pulse with a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm that wasn't quite constant. My ears strained, trying to discern if there was a faint, high-pitched whine woven into the machinery's drone, a sound only I could hear. I felt a growing separation from everything else. My colleagues' calls became an irritating distraction. The thought of stepping outside, of interacting with the mundane world, felt like an insurmountable effort. This signal was my world now, my singular obsession. It was a terrifying, beautiful, maddening puzzle, and I was utterly, irrevocably hooked. For days, I'd been lost in the data, sifting through the impossible signal, trying to force it into some semblance of known physics. It was a relentless current, pulling me deeper into its unintelligible depths. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced by the bitter taste of stale coffee and the metallic tang of exhaustion in my mouth. My determination, however, remained an unyielding anchor in the swirling anomaly. The first flicker was almost imperceptible. A brief shudder across the main display, just enough to blur the cascading spectral analysis for a fraction of a second. I blinked, rubbing the grit from my eyes, attributing it to a momentary power fluctuation or my own fatigue. The ambient hum of the installation, usually a steady drone, seemed to waver, deepening into a resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor plates. I pressed my palm against the cool metal of the console, feeling the subtle tremor beneath my fingers. Was it just the machinery or something else entirely? Then it happened again, more pronounced this time. The array of secondary monitors, usually a crisp display of system diagnostics, rippled like water. Pixels fractured into chaotic static for a heartbeat before snapping back to normal. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, my gaze darting from screen to screen. A chill, sudden and sharp, traced its way up my spine, despite the regulated warmth of the control room. I checked the power logs, but they showed no anomalies, no surges, no dips. The system was reporting perfect stability, yet my eyes and ears told a different story. The hum intensified, not louder, but richer, as if layers of sound were being subtly added beneath the familiar drone. It felt like a low, sustained chord played on an instrument I couldn't name, a sound that seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but in the very bones of my skull. My temples began to ache. I stood, stretching my stiff back, and walked to the small kitchenette for more coffee, trying to shake off the growing unease. The air felt heavy, thick, as if the oxygen had thinned. As I poured the steaming liquid, a shadow detached itself from the corner of my vision. I spun around, my mug clattering against the counter, sending hot coffee splashing onto my hand. Nothing, just the faint glow of indicator lights reflecting on polished surfaces. My heart hammered against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, then opened them again. The room was empty, save for me and the silently whirring machines. Was I finally cracking? I returned to the console, forcing myself to focus on the signal. Perhaps the disruptions were a byproduct of its sheer energetic output, a side effect of its impossible nature. The signal itself remained maddeningly consistent, a complex tapestry of frequencies that defied all attempts at decryption. It was a language, I was certain, but one without an alphabet or grammar known to humanity. I began to search beyond the standard astrophysical databases, venturing into archives of forgotten research, historical accounts of unexplained phenomena, anything that might offer a parallel, however remote. It was in a digitized collection of obscure philosophical treatises and fringe scientific papers from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that I found the first unsettling echoes. These weren't scientific papers in the modern sense, but they hinted at something far older, far more unsettling than mere astronomical anomalies. I followed a chain of cross-references, leading me to a series of heavily redacted government documents detailing strange cult activity in the 1930s. They spoke of listening for the call from beyond the veil, believing it would usher in a new, terrifying age. I pulled my worn sweater tighter around me. The low, resonant hum of the installation now seemed less like machinery and more like a vast, unseen throat clearing itself. I could almost feel a pressure against my eardrums, as if something immense was pressing in from all sides. They weren't just anomalies, they were a pattern stretching back through time, a testament to something that had been trying to communicate or perhaps to influence for millennia. And why did their cryptic symbols feel so terribly, undeniably familiar? The redacted government documents were a dead end, or perhaps a beginning I wasn't equipped to interpret. My eyes burned, tracing lines of censored text that hinted at phenomena dismissed as mass hysteria or unclassified atmospheric events. What I'd found wasn't a smoking gun, but a collection of whispers, echoes of something ancient that had brushed against human perception before. My fingers, still trembling from the cold dread the files evoked, finally lifted from the keyboard. The air in my small office felt heavy, stale. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no refuge. I was falling. Around me, shapes shifted, not in the way light refracts, but as if the very geometry of space was fluid, malleable. Angles bent into impossible curves, then snapped back into sharp, crystalline points that threatened to pierce me. There was a sound, a low thrum that vibrated not in my ears, but in my bones, a resonant frequency that spoke of immense size and indifferent power. It wasn't loud, but it filled everything, a deep, pervasive hum that felt like the universe itself was clearing its throat. And then a presence. A silent, knowing wait. I tried to scream, but my throat was solid ice. My limbs were useless. All I could do was fall and feel and drown in that silent, terrible hum. I woke with a gasp, my body convulsing, tangled in the damp sheets. My breath hitched in my chest. The hum, that bone-deep vibration, lingered, a phantom echo in the quiet apartment. For a long moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to anchor myself to the familiar patterns of the plaster, the mundane hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was a dream, I told myself, a byproduct of too much caffeine and those unsettling government files. My mind, overstimulated, was playing tricks. That was all it could be. The determination to dismiss it as a mere dream propelled me out of bed and into the harsh light of a new day. I needed to focus, to ground myself in the empirical data, to prove that my intellect was still sharp, still rational, and I had to understand it. The control room, usually a sanctuary of logic and reason, felt different today. The air seemed thinner, the light from the monitors harsher. I settled into my chair, the plastic cool against my skin, and brought up the latest spectral analysis. The familiar patterns, the impossible complexity, scrolled across the screen. I traced a particularly convoluted sequence, my fingers hovering over the controls. Then the hum returned. It wasn't a memory, not an echo. It was here now, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor, up my legs, and into my skull. The monitors flickered, not a technical glitch, but a momentary distortion, as if the very light waves were bending. The data on the screen seemed to shimmer, the lines of code rippling like water. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My hand froze on the console. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The monitors were steady, the data clear. The smell was gone. The hum had faded, had it? Or was it merely retreating, a tide pulling back from a shore, only to return with greater force? "Raj!" A voice called from the doorway. It was a colleague, the senior technician, carrying a mug of coffee. "Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt alien on my face. Just a long night, too much staring at impossible numbers. The technician nodded, oblivious. "Tell me about it." I tried to resume my work, but my focus was shattered. I felt a prickling sensation on my neck, the distinct feeling of being watched, observed with an indifference that was more terrifying than malice. My skin crawled. The air grew heavy again, pressing down on me, making it difficult to draw a full breath. The data on the screen blurred, not from tired eyes, but from an actual distortion. The lines of the spectral analysis began to weave, to form impossible, intricate patterns that defied all known geometry. They twisted into Escher-like constructions, vast and complex, shimmering with an inner light that was not of this world. They were not looking at me, but through the data, through the screen, through reality itself, as if my observations were merely a thin veil to be parted. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, rattling the keyboard. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination induced by lack of sleep. This was real. The signal wasn't just data, it was a doorway, and something was stepping through right into my mind. My throat was dry, raw. I pushed back from the console, stumbling. The room spun, not from dizziness, but from the sudden, profound shift in my perception. Was the room even real? Were the walls still solid? Or were they merely illusions, a temporary construct masking something infinitely vaster, infinitely more alien? My breath came in ragged gasps. I could feel the presence, a crushing weight in the room, unseen but undeniably there, an immense, silent observer. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind, or was my mind simply being open to a truth too terrible to comprehend? The silence after the technician left was a heavy blanket, muffling the world. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a deliberate hush, as if the very air around me was holding its breath. I tried to dismiss it, to force my attention back to the flickering readouts of the signal at the radio telescope installation, signal received, not from space. But my mind was a fractured pane of glass, reflecting not data, but the inexplicable patterns, the impossible complexity of what I'd found. Every now and then, a faint, almost subliminal thrum seemed to vibrate in the floor beneath my feet, a phantom echo of the signal's rhythm. I told myself it was the building's old HVAC or my own overactive imagination. Yet the unease persisted, a cold pebble lodged beneath my ribs. I spent the next few days in a frenzied blur, trying to make sense of the new data, preparing my presentation. The signal wasn't just an anomaly, it was a conscious, structured communication defying every known law of physics. It pulsed with an intent, a vast, patient awareness that seemed to be observing, waiting. The idea felt absurd, monstrous even to me, but the data didn't lie. The patterns were undeniable, too intricate, too deliberate to be anything but. I scheduled a presentation, a formal review with some of the senior researchers and a project lead. The meeting room was stark, smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the polished table. My hands, I noticed, were clammy as I loaded the visual aids onto the screen. "Thank I for coming." I began, my voice a little rougher than I intended. I showed them the waveform analysis, the complex, non-repeating sequences that mimicked, in their abstract way, the structure of language or, perhaps, thought itself. The project lead, a stern woman with sharp eyes, watched me impassively. A colleague, usually affable, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. I could feel their skepticism, a palpable wall rising between us. "And I rest certain this isn't a calibration error, Raj?" The project lead asked, his tone carefully neutral, laced with a hint of concern. "A unique atmospheric interference?" "I've triple-checked everything," I insisted, my voice rising a fraction. "Every filter, every antenna array, we've even cross-referenced with other observatories. The signal is real, and it's coming from nowhere we understand. It's communicating." I brought up the advanced pattern recognition algorithms I'd developed, the ones that had started to decipher fragments, not of numbers or images, but of something far more unsettling. I described the feeling it evoked in me, the sense of an immense, ancient presence. How could I convey the crushing weight of that alien intelligence, the sheer wrongness of its existence, without sounding unhinged? "Raj," the project lead interrupted, his voice softer now, almost placating. "I understand my excitement. This is certainly an interesting anomaly. That's quite a leap beyond any empirical evidence I've presented." "The evidence is there," I countered, pointing to a complex fractal-like pattern on the screen. "Look at this. This isn't random. This isn't natural phenomenon. It's too precise, too intricate. It's like finding a perfectly formed sentence carved into the surface of Mars and dismissing it as wind erosion." My breath came a little faster. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the podium. The colleague cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should take some time away from the data, Raj. I've been working on this for months, almost exclusively. It can be disorienting." Disorienting. That was the polite word for it. They thought I was losing my grip. I could see it in their eyes, the pity, the veiled concern, the subtle glances exchanged between them. My conviction, which felt like clarity to me, must have looked like madness to them. My jaw tightened. I felt a flush spread across my face. They weren't seeing what I was seeing. They couldn't or wouldn't see it. The meeting ended quickly after that, a polite dismissal wrapped in scientific jargon. No one said I was wrong, not outright. They just suggested further peer review, independent verification, and a mandatory sabbatical for me. My access to the primary data streams at the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was quietly restricted. Emails went unanswered. Lunch invitations stopped. I still returned to my workstation late at night when the building was mostly empty. The glowing screens were my only companions. They had shut me out, but the universe, or something beyond it, was still speaking. Driven by a desperate, gnawing need for understanding, I knew I couldn't rely on conventional science anymore. They had their rules, their comfortable boundaries. What I had found shattered those boundaries. I needed something else, something older, something that acknowledged the impossible. My mind drifted to a memory from my university days, a dusty, forbidden corner of the library that held texts deemed pseudo-scientific or occult. I remembered an old, eccentric professor, long since retired, who had a private collection of obscure manuscripts, dismissed by the academic community as the ravings of madmen and mystics. Leaving the silent halls of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, I drove through the night, the city lights blurring into streaks of orange and white. The world felt thin, a flimsy veil over something vast and terrible. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt figure in a moth-eaten robe, his eyes milky with age but sharp with an unsettling awareness. He remembered me, surprisingly. His study was a labyrinth of towering bookshelves, the air thick with the smell of aging paper, dust, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old blood or forgotten iron. He listened patiently, his head tilted, as I recounted my findings, omitting the specifics of the signal, focusing instead on the feeling it evoked, the sense of an ancient conscious presence. They never look there, do they? Too empty for their tidy equations. He turned and gestured to a shelf filled with brittle, leather-bound volumes, some with strange symbols etched into their covers. You seek answers beyond the quantifiable, Raj. You seek the things that stir in the cosmic slumber. And for that, you must look where humanity has always feared to tread. He pulled out a heavy, unbound collection of faded etchings and handwritten notes, its pages yellowed and fragile. The script was archaic, almost unreadable in places. As I carefully turned the brittle pages, my eyes fell upon an illustration, a series of interlocking geometric shapes, radiating from a central, undefined point. It was a crude depiction, but the pattern was eerily similar to the non-Euclidean geometries I had begun to discern within the signal. This wasn't some abstract philosophical musing. What was this forgotten lore, and how could it describe something I was only now discovering through the most advanced instruments of the age? Was this just coincidence, or had humanity once possessed a terrifying elder truth that it had deliberately buried? My breath hitched. The metallic tang in the air suddenly felt sharper, colder. This was a direct, chilling parallel. What was this awful coincidence, this echo from centuries past? The ancient text, crumpled now in my trembling hand, felt suddenly alive, a conduit for something I couldn't grasp, something that twisted my gut with an unfamiliar unease. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Coincidence. A shared human fear, perhaps, manifesting across different eras. But the specificity, the resonance I felt, argued against it. It felt less like a shared fear and more like a shared knowledge, one that had been carefully hidden away. I pulled my gaze from the yellowed pages, my eyes landing on the glowing monitors that filled the small, cramped control room of the radio telescope installation, signal received, not from space. The digital readouts pulsed with the incomprehensible data stream, a relentless flood of complex patterns and resonant frequencies. My initial excitement, that pure, unadulterated thrill of discovery, had curdled into something far more unsettling. Now, a desperate, almost feverish need to understand gnawed at me. I had to know if the signal truly mirrored these archaic warnings, if it spoke of the same terrifying truths. The air in the room, usually just stale and tinged with ozone from the equipment, now seemed to press in on me, heavy and thick. I could hear the low thrum of the cooling fans, the occasional soft click of a relay, the distant, almost imperceptible whine of the dish turning on its axis outside. Each sound was amplified, sharpened by the sudden, intense focus of my fear. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not the kind that invigorates, but the kind that makes my muscles feel weak, my movements clumsy. My colleagues, when they occasionally poked their heads in, saw only my usual intensity, perhaps a bit more disheveled than usual. They didn't see the frantic scramble in my mind. The way I was chasing an answer I already suspected would shatter everything. The algorithms I'd developed were advanced, designed to parse information from chaotic data sets to find order in what appeared to be randomness. But this signal, it defied everything. It wasn't just random, it was alien in its structure, its very syntax an affront to human logic. It wasn't a language to be translated, but something more fundamental, a direct imprint of information. I tried every permutation, every statistical analysis, every pattern-matching technique I knew. Nothing yielded more than tantalizing, fragmented glimpses. Then late one night, as the digital clock on my main monitor clicked past 3 a.m., something shifted. I had been attempting a novel approach, feeding the signal through a neural network I designed, letting it search for nonlinear correlations, for echoes, for reverberations. My eyelids felt heavy, gritty. I was about to give up, to admit defeat for the night, when a sudden, almost imperceptible flicker caught my eye on a secondary display. A small segment of the signal, one I dismissed as noise countless times, began to resolve. It wasn't a linguistic translation, not words or symbols I could recognize. Instead, it felt like a direct download, a sudden, jarring influx of understanding that bypassed my conscious mind and settled deep within my bones. The first concept hit me like a physical blow. Irrelevance. Not just intellectual insignificance, but an absolute, crushing existential irrelevance. Humanity, our history, our aspirations, our entire planet, our sun, our galaxy, all of it was less than a speck of dust. We were a fleeting, microscopic shimmer on the surface of something so vast, so ancient, so utterly indifferent, that the very notion of our existence was a cosmic joke. Then came the second download, a deeper horror. The cosmos wasn't empty. It was full of vast, incomprehensible presences, entities, not beings in any sense I understood, but forces, consciousnesses that operated on scales that defied measurement, on principles that inverted reality. They weren't merely beyond our understanding, they were antithetical to it. They moved in the lightless gulfs, not as metaphors, but as descriptions of their true dominion, spaces where the very laws of physics warped and dissolved. A tremor ran through me, starting in my fingertips and coursing through my entire body. My vision blurred for a moment, the glowing screen seeming to swim before my eyes. My stomach churned, a sudden, intense nausea rising in my throat. I pressed my palms against my temples, as if to physically push back against the onslaught of these alien concepts. They weren't just data points. They were truths being imprinted directly onto my consciousness, reshaping the very foundations of my reality. My understanding of the universe, of physics, of life itself, began to unravel. Things that had always been there, slumbering, ancient beyond comprehension, utterly uncaring of the ephemeral blip that was our existence. My teeth began to chatter, a nervous tic I couldn't control. I could feel a low hum vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. Or was it just my own nerves screaming? What else would it reveal? My breath hitched. What was T? I looked at the screen, at the flowing stream of symbols, then back at the ancient text, its faded characters now seeming to pulse with a malevolent significance. The parallels were undeniable, terrifying in their precision. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a resonance, an echo across unimaginable gulfs of time and existence. The knowledge I was extracting, word by agonizing word, was not merely data. It was a poison, a truth that seemed designed to corrode the very foundations of understanding. Sleep became an indulgence I could no longer afford, or perhaps no longer desired. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. The fluorescent hum of the control room, the rhythmic click of the keyboards, the low thrum of the servers, these became the soundtrack to my waking nightmare. I existed on lukewarm coffee and stale energy bars, my focus narrowing to the deciphered stream of information. The words spoke of a reality far vaster, far older than anything humanity had ever conceived. They hinted at architects, not of stars or galaxies, but of the very fabric of existence, entities that predated light itself, slumbering in the interdimensional folds of the cosmos. I could feel the change in me, a creeping transformation from the inside out. The soft tissue of my face was receding, leaving the stark architecture of bone. I felt an incessant hum beneath my skin, a low vibration that seemed to match the frequency of the signal itself, though I knew that was impossible, or was it? A colleague, one of the junior observers, stopped by my station. "Raj, you look exhausted. You should really try to get some rest." His voice, usually a cheerful murmur, seemed distant, a buzzing fly I barely registered. I didn't look up from the screen. "Rest is a luxury," I mumbled, my voice rough, unused. "There's too much to uncover." My fingers twitched over the keyboard, already translating the next string of impossibly ancient symbols. "But you've been at it for days," the colleague pressed, his tone tinged with concern. "We're all worried. You haven't left the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space in weeks. We can cover your shifts." Weeks. It felt like a lifetime. The idea of leaving, of stepping away from the data, felt absurd, like abandoning a part of myself. The world outside, the mundane concerns of human interaction, of sunlight and fresh air, seemed utterly trivial compared to the revelations unfolding before me. What did a sunset matter when the very sky was a lie? Their worries about schedules, about budgets, about the latest news, it all seemed like childish babbling, a meaningless distraction from the monumental truth I was slowly unearthing. My attention drifted, not to my colleague, but to the wall behind him. For a fleeting second, the smooth, painted surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. The pale beige paint pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible green, then snapped back to its original shade. I blinked, my eyes burning. A trick of the light. Fatigue playing havoc with my vision, I dismissed it, turning back to the deciphered text. But then it happened again. Later that day, as I stared at the ceiling panels, the straight lines of the grid seemed to bow, to warp inwards for a fraction of a second, as if the very structure of the room was breathing, flexing. It wasn't just a ripple this time. It was a distinct, undeniable distortion, like a glitch in reality. I rubbed my eyes, the gritty sensation doing little to clear my vision. There was I finally losing it. There was the lack of sleep. The sheer volume of impossible knowledge finally breaking me. The distortions grew more frequent, more brazen. A shadow cast by a discarded coffee cup would stretch impossibly long, then retract. The sharp edge of a desk would shimmer, losing its definition before solidifying once more. Then just as suddenly, the hum would return, as if reality had simply forgotten to render sound for a moment. I started to perceive subtle shifts in the color spectrum, colors that shouldn't exist, fleeting hues of violet and deep, unsettling ochre that danced at the periphery of my vision, gone before I could properly focus on them. I would clench my fists, trying to reaffirm their reality, their connection to me. One evening, as the last of the natural light faded outside the reinforced windows, I looked across the control room. The lights were dim, most of the other stations empty. A lone technician was packing up his bag, his back to me. As he moved, his form seemed to stretch, to elongate, his limbs becoming unnaturally long, his head a small, distant point. He was like a warped reflection in a funhouse mirror, yet the glass was perfectly flat. Then, with a sickening snap, he returned to normal, his movements fluid and human again. He turned, gave a brief nod, and left. He hadn't noticed a thing. He hadn't seen the world twist around him. These weren't hallucinations. These were glimpses. The world I had known, the solid, predictable reality, was merely a surface. A fragile skin stretched over something vast and utterly alien. And that skin was beginning to tear. What else would I begin to see now that my eyes were being opened? Weeks? What did any of it matter? My vision blurred at the edges, a constant companion these past days. The hum of the servers in the control room of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was a low thrum against my skull, a sound I no longer consciously registered, much like the stale, recycled air that tasted metallic on my tongue. I'd lost track of time, of meals, of sleep. All that existed was the screen, the endless streams of data, and the insidious presence that had begun to coalesce within them. At first, I'd processed the signal as an observation, a phenomenon to be catalogued and analyzed, a distant, complex whisper from an impossible source. But as I delved deeper, stripping away layers of cosmic static, filtering out the mundane background radiation, a terrifying shift occurred in my perception. It wasn't just there. It wasn't just broadcasting. It was reaching. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the cool glass. The intricate, non-repeating patterns on the display pulsed with a rhythm that felt increasingly familiar, almost intimate. My fingers, stained with lukewarm coffee, hovered over the keyboard. Every anomaly, every subtle inflection in the waveforms began to stitch together a coherent narrative. A narrative that wasn't about physics or astrophysics, but about intent. The void between the cosmic structures, that vast, seemingly empty expanse, wasn't merely a silent backdrop. It was a throat, and the signal was a resonant vibration, a low, guttural sound echoing from an unseen maw. I scrubbed a hand over my unshaven jaw, the stubble rough against my palm. The idea had been forming, a dangerous ember in the back of my mind for days. The signal wasn't just an observation, it was a beckoning. It was a deliberate, targeted call, and I, in my isolated hubris, had been the one to answer, or rather to tune in. My gaze drifted to the array of controls, the blinking lights of the main console. The dishes outside, massive white sentinels against the perpetually overcast sky, were pointed not at a star, not at a galaxy, but at that precise, terrifying null point. I had been refining the receivers, pushing them beyond their operational limits, not to detect more signal, but to clarify what was already there, to make the beckoning undeniable. A tremor ran through me. It was a foolish, suicidal impulse. To amplify the connection, to strip away the last vestiges of interference, would be to invite it in, to open a direct channel between my fragile consciousness and whatever incomprehensible entity resided within that cosmic emptiness. The risk of mental collapse was not theoretical, it felt like an imminent certainty. My colleagues, if they were still speaking to me, would call it madness. But they hadn't heard what I had heard. They hadn't felt the subtle, insistent tug. My hand, as if guided by an external will, reached for the console. There was a specific sequence of adjustments, a recalibration of the primary sensor array that would bypass the standard filtering protocols. It was a raw, unfiltered feed, designed only for diagnostic purposes, never for sustained reception. It would be like staring directly into the heart of a supernova, not with my eyes, but with my mind. A knot tightened in my stomach. My mouth was dry, tasting of dust and fear. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to disconnect, to run from this place and never look back. But a stronger, more primal urge compelled me forward, a desperate, burning need to understand, to peel back the final veil and witness the true nature of the universe, no matter the cost. I began the sequence. The console chirped, a series of muted tones echoing in the quiet room. The dishes outside, I imagined, shifted almost imperceptibly, their massive forms aligning with a terrifying precision. The hum of the servers intensified, a low groan that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very bones. My fingers moved with an unnatural dexterity, inputting the commands. The screen flickered, the familiar patterns momentarily dissolving into a chaotic storm of static, then re-emerging, sharper, more defined than ever before. A pressure built behind my eyes, a dull ache that quickly sharpened into a searing pain. My temples throbbed. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't just an auditory signal anymore. I could feel it, a profound, undeniable weight pressing down on me, a vast, indifferent consciousness that had been roused. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight. My breath hitched in my throat. It was teeming with something immense, something ancient, and it was reaching for me. What would happen when I truly let it in? What did it even mean to step away? The question echoed, thin and reedy, against the roaring cataract of data that now defined my existence. The air in the control room, within the confines of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, felt thick, heavy with the hum of electronics and the faint metallic tang of ozone. Weeks. I had pushed the amplification again. Past every safety protocol, past every warning light that now blinked a silent, desperate chorus around me. The console glowed with a sickly green light, its screens a maelstrom of spectral graphs and incomprehensible patterns. My fingers, slick with a fine sheen of perspiration, danced across the controls, making minute adjustments, chasing the elusive heart of the signal. My eyes burned, gritty and dry, but I couldn't tear them away. Not now, not when I was so close. A new sensation began to bloom in the cavern of my skull, not a sound, but an overwhelming presence. It wasn't the distant, mathematical hum I'd grown accustomed to. This was closer, vast, and immediate, like a mountain range suddenly appearing inside my chest. The air grew colder despite the heat of the electronics, raising gooseflesh on my forearms. I shivered, a deep, involuntary tremor that shook my entire frame. My vision, already strained, began to blur at the edges, not from fatigue, but as if the very light in the room was warping. The sharp lines of the consoles, the familiar geometry of the room, softened, then rippled. It was like watching heat rise from asphalt on a summer day, but instead of shimmering air, it was the fundamental structure of my perception itself that was wavering. A low thrum, felt more in my bones than heard with my ears, vibrated through the floor. It was a resonance, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate the very atoms of my being. Then it hit me, not as an image, but as a cascade of pure, unfiltered information that bypassed my senses entirely and plunged directly into the raw, processing core of my mind. It was a form, yes, but not one that could be perceived through human sight or touch. It was a construct of pure thought, a tapestry woven from the fundamental laws of the cosmos, but seen from an angle that shouldn't exist. I gasped, a dry, choked sound, as my mind tried to grapple with the impossible. It wasn't a creature, not a being with limbs or eyes or a physical body. It was an arrangement, an architecture of cosmic intent. Imagine trying to perceive a symphony not as sound, but as the underlying mathematical principles that govern its harmony, its rhythm, its emotional impact, all at once in a single crushing moment. That was it. It was the pattern behind all patterns, the silent, indifferent architect of reality itself. My head snapped back, hitting the high-backed chair with a dull thud. A searing pressure built behind my eyes as if my optic nerves were trying to channel a supernova. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms, leaving crescent marks. My breath hitched, caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. This wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion. My mind felt like a fragile glass pane pressed against an infinite, swirling vortex. The entity's true form was a living algorithm, an evolving equation that was the universe. It wasn't in space, it was space. It wasn't in time, it was time. And I, Raj, was a microscopic anomaly attempting to chart its vast, indifferent currents. The signal wasn't a message from it, but a faint, almost imperceptible ripple of it. And then the understanding came, cold and absolute, piercing through the terror like a shard of black ice. Its purpose. It wasn't malicious, not in any human sense. It was simply being. And its being entailed a slow, inevitable reshaping. Not destruction, but a transformation so fundamental, so complete, that the reality I knew, the laws of physics I had dedicated my life to understanding, were merely temporary constructs, fleeting arrangements within its grand, ceaseless work. Humanity, with all its striving, its triumphs, its tragedies, was less than dust. We were motes, ephemeral blips in the cosmic design, destined to be reabsorbed, reconfigured, or simply swept away by the inexorable current of its existence. We were not even an inconvenience, we simply were, for now, until the next iteration of its cosmic symphony. The universe wasn't being ruled by slumbering entities, it was the slumbering entity slowly, unconsciously stirring. A profound, suffocating sense of insignificance settled over me. My body felt numb, disconnected. The thrumming intensified, vibrating through my very bones until my teeth chattered uncontrollably. The air grew thin, hard to draw into my lungs. It was too much. The sheer scale, the utter indifference. My mind screamed, a silent internal shriek against the crushing weight of this cosmic truth. The world I knew, the orderly cosmos, the very concept of existence, was a fleeting dream within a larger, incomprehensible nightmare. The console lights, the hum of the machines, the familiar scent of ozone, they all felt distant, unreal. I was still sitting in my chair in the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, but my perception was irrevocably altered. The veil had been torn. What could I do with such a truth, when the very act of knowing it felt like my sanity was unraveling into a million shimmering threads? The question of stepping away still echoed, thin and reedy, against the roaring cataract of data that now defined my existence. The air in the control room, within the confines of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, felt thick, heavy with the hum of electronics. It clung to my skin, a metallic tang on my tongue, and a subtle vibration that never quite left the soles of my feet. I hadn't really left this room in days, not truly. Each time I'd tried to step out, even just for a breath of fresh air, the sheer gravitational pull of the screens, the insistent whisper of the signal had tugged me back. It felt less like a choice and more like an involuntary reflex, an instinct for a truth I was compelled to unearth. When I finally did force myself through the heavy door and into the narrow corridor, the silence was almost deafening after the constant thrum. My ears rang. The fluorescent lights hummed with a different, less urgent cadence. I felt a strange lightness, then a sudden, jarring heaviness, as if my body had momentarily forgotten how to carry itself. The corridor stretched, sterile and unwelcoming. I pushed a hand against the cool, painted cinder block wall, steadying myself. My fingers traced the rough texture, a small, grounding detail in a world that felt increasingly unmoored. Outside, the change was immediate and unsettling. The sky wasn't right. It wasn't just a matter of clouds or weather patterns, it was the light itself. It had a bruised quality, a sickly yellow-green tint that permeated everything, making the familiar landscape of scrub brush and distant, low hills appear alien. The air, usually crisp and dry, felt strangely viscous, clinging to my lungs with each breath. It carried a faint, coppery scent, like old pennies left out in the rain, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place, a scent of ozone and something profoundly ancient, like stone dust from a forgotten tomb. My eyes strained, trying to reconcile the visual input with what my brain insisted was normal. The sun, a pale disk behind the haze, seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if struggling against an unseen pressure. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. This wasn't a natural phenomenon, I knew it with a sickening certainty. This was it. A maintenance worker pushing a cart of tools passed me without a glance. Their shoulders were hunched, movements sluggish, almost dreamlike. Their eyes, when they briefly flickered in my direction, held a vacant, unfocused quality, like an old photograph fading at the edges. They didn't seem to notice the sky, or if they did, it didn't register as anything out of the ordinary. They just kept pushing, the squeak of the cart wheels a mundane counterpoint to the cosmic dread blooming in my chest. I wanted to stop them, to point upwards, to ask if they felt it, this strange, pervasive wrongness. But the words caught in my throat. What would I even say? Don't you see the sky is bleeding? Days bled into a week. The phenomena intensified. The bruised light became a constant, a permanent filter over the world. There were times when the sky itself seemed to shift, to ripple like disturbed water, though no wind stirred. A low-frequency hum started, originating from no discernible source, seeping through the ground, vibrating through the concrete of the radio telescope installation. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless, a dull throb that settled deep in my bones, making my teeth ache. Birds, usually a noisy constant, were silent. I saw a flock of starlings one morning, wheeling in tight, erratic patterns, then suddenly plummeting, not quite falling to the ground, but gliding down in a collective, silent descent to perch on the fence line, unmoving for hours. What had caused them to abandon their instincts? News reports, accessed through a tablet I rarely looked at anymore, painted a disturbing picture. Not just here, but globally. Unexplained atmospheric events were being dismissed as unprecedented weather anomalies. Reports spoke of mass apathy in some regions, people simply stopping, sitting, staring into space, losing interest in work, family, even food. Then in other places, sudden, irrational bursts of fear, leading to panic, minor riots, inexplicable acts of aggression over trivial matters. I saw it in the few colleagues I encountered, the way their conversations drifted, the way their eyes seemed to hold a flicker of unease they couldn't name. I was a conduit, I realized with sickening clarity, a receiver for the entity's spreading influence. The screens in the control room still showed the raw data, the impossible signal, but now, when I looked up, I felt a deeper connection, a horrifying understanding of its reach. One evening, a particularly vivid atmospheric event unfolded. The bruised sky above the installation began to deepen, shifting from yellow-green to an impossible violet, then to a swirling, mottled gray that seemed to absorb all light. And then it wasn't just light. The sky itself seemed to breathe. A slow, colossal inhalation and exhalation, visible in the shifting, churning clouds, accompanied by a sound felt more than heard. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through my chest cavity, rattling the very foundations of the radio telescope installation. It felt like the universe itself was clearing its throat, preparing to speak. I stood there watching the screens, watching the data, but my mind was on the world beyond these walls. It was seeping, bleeding into reality, coloring the sky, unsettling the minds of millions. What would happen when the veil thinned completely for everyone? The low-frequency hum, once a subtle thrum beneath the floor plates of the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, had deepened. It was a resonant tremor now, a vibration that settled in my teeth, a constant, irritating pressure behind my eyes. The bruised light, a sickly purple-gray, had become the only light. The sun, if it was still there, was a memory. The sky above the dish, once a familiar expanse of blue or star-pricked black, was a roiling tapestry of impossible hues like oil on water, but the water was the very fabric of existence. My determination, once a steady flame, flickered under the ceaseless onslaught. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, a fragile state where the hum intensified, where the shifting sky bled into my dreams, twisting them into grotesque, non-Euclidean nightmares. I found myself staring at the console's screens, not for data, but for reassurance. The familiar readouts, the lines of code, they were anchors in a sea of unraveling. But even those anchors were beginning to drag. The first impossible geometry I noticed was in the observation deck. A colleague, the one who still occasionally brought me lukewarm coffee, was staring intently at a wall. "Look," he mumbled, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's breathing." I followed his gaze. The concrete wall, a solid, unyielding surface, was indeed breathing. Not like a chest expanding, but like a vast, unseen lung. It swelled inward, then outward, not uniformly, but in sections that didn't quite align. A patch near the ceiling would ripple while the floorboards below it pulsed in a different rhythm. The corners where two walls met seemed to fold in on themselves, only to snap back, creating momentary, sharp creases that vanished as quickly as they appeared. My breath hitched. I wanted to tell him it was an illusion, a trick of the light, but the light itself was part of the trick. He just stood there watching, his face slack. He didn't seem afraid, just absorbed. That was perhaps more terrifying than any scream. I stumbled back to my workstation, my hands shaking as I tried to log the observation. How do I quantify a wall breathing? How do I record a corner that folds into an impossible angle? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The air in the control room was thick, almost viscous. It felt like I was moving through warm syrup. The hum vibrated through the chair up my spine, directly into my skull. Then came the bending of natural laws. It started subtly. A pen I'd left on my desk rolled uphill an inch before stopping. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A vibration, an uneven surface, but the desk was level, reinforced steel. Later, I watched a drop of condensation on the window pane climb slowly against gravity, clinging to the glass, then suddenly accelerate downwards, only to reverse course halfway, hanging suspended, quivering before finally releasing itself. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a signal anymore. This was interference, a direct physical intrusion. The lights in the facility, usually a consistent, sterile white, began to flicker with an unnatural intensity. Not a short-circuit kind of flicker, but a strobe-like pulse that didn't correspond to any power fluctuation. It was as if the light itself was struggling, trying to maintain its form against an unseen pressure. The shadows it cast were wrong. Too long, too sharp, sometimes moving independently of their source, stretching across the floor like grasping tendrils. I saw my own shadow detach for a moment, a darker, more distorted version of myself, before it snapped back, seamlessly joining me once more. The hum intensified further, growing into a guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath my feet, from the walls around me. It wasn't sound I heard with my ears so much as felt with my entire being, a deep, resonant vibration that threatened to shake me apart. I clutched the edge of my console, gripped tight. The air shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, the room seemed to stretch, distorting my vision, making the familiar equipment seem alien, elongated, like a funhouse mirror reflection. Outside, the few remaining technicians, those who hadn't simply walked away or perhaps just vanished, moved with a strange, detached slowness. I saw one of them, a maintenance engineer who used to joke about the endless repairs on the dish, standing perfectly still in the rain, his head tilted back, staring at the bruised, rippling sky. He wasn't sheltering, wasn't moving. He just stood there, letting the impossible light wash over him, his face utterly blank. His tools lay scattered around his feet, forgotten. It was happening to them too, this slow, agonizing unraveling of the mind. The collective consciousness was fraying piece by piece. I realized then that the signal wasn't just sending information. It was imposing it. It was rewriting the very rules of existence, one impossible geometry, one bending law, one blank stare at a time. My own mind felt stretched, thin, like a membrane about to tear. I was witnessing the dawn of a new reality, one sculpted by something utterly alien, utterly vast, and I had been the one to find the key. What would the world look like when the rewriting was complete? The hum, it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a texture, a constant, low-frequency pressure against my eardrums, vibrating through the bones of my skull. The radio telescope installation, signal received, not from space, felt less like a building and more like a resonant cavity, amplifying something unspeakable. The bruised light, a sickly purple-red, pulsed in time with that unseen vibration. It bled through the thick observation glass, staining the control panels, my skin, the very air. My vision felt, stretched. The edges of things wavered, breathing in and out like tired lungs. I pressed my palms against the cold metal of the console, seeking an anchor. But the metal itself seemed to hum, a deep internal thrum that mirrored the one in my own chest. My heart was beating, I knew, but its rhythm felt alien, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, deliberate pulse that was now the dominant beat of my existence. My throat was dry, raspy, as if I'd been screaming for hours, though no sound had escaped me since the last time the colleague had tried to speak to me, days ago. He'd left eventually. They all had. I was alone with the signal. The air, thick and metallic, pressed down on me. I could taste it, a faint, acrid tang that coated my tongue. It tasted like ozone and something else, something ancient and mineral like crushed rock from a place that had never known sunlight. My eyes, I noticed, felt wider, their pupils dilated beyond reason in the dim, bruised light. I could see the minute dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny world, each one vibrating with the same hum. The detail was overwhelming, yet strangely calming. It was a clarity I hadn't known I lacked until now. A chill, not of temperature, but of immense, indifferent scale, crept along my spine. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of an abyss, not looking down, but looking up at something vast and impossibly distant, yet somehow right here within the confines of the room. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a presence. It was the air I breathed, the light I saw, the very pulse of my own blood. It had permeated everything, and I, willingly or not, had allowed it to permeate me. What was I becoming, tethered to such a thing? My fingers, tracing the glowing lines of data on the screen, felt oddly elongated, more sensitive. I could feel the microscopic ridges of the plastic, the faint warmth radiating from the circuits beneath. The numbers, the complex algorithms, they weren't just symbols anymore. They were alive, each digit a tiny nexus of energy, singing in silent chorus with the hum. It was as if I could understand them, not with my intellect, but with some deeper, more primal part of my being that had been awakened. I closed my eyes. The bruised light persisted, an internal aurora borealis behind my lids, swirling with patterns that defied geometry. They were patterns of connection, of impossible structures folding in on themselves, yet expanding infinitely. My mind, once a precise instrument of logic and reason, felt like a prism shattering, each shard reflecting a different, terrifying facet of a reality I had never even conceived. There was this sanity or its complete dissolution. A faint scratching sound, like insect legs on dry paper, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was delicate, almost imperceptible, yet it cut through the all-encompassing hum. I opened my eyes. Nothing moved in the room. It was inside my head. I realized, not outside. A new layer of perception had peeled back, revealing the constant, unseen chorus of every tiny living thing in the building, their frantic, minuscule lives echoing in my awareness. It was a cacophony, yet I could distinguish each individual tremor, each tiny flutter of wings. My senses were betraying me, or perhaps, finally, revealing everything. I stood, my movements slow, deliberate, as if my body had become a new, unfamiliar instrument. My limbs felt heavier, yet more fluid. My skin tingled, a constant effervescence, as if tiny, unseen currents were flowing just beneath the surface. My eyes were too wide, too bright, reflecting the purple glow with an intensity that felt unnatural. The angles of my face seemed sharper, my jaw more defined. I looked like myself, but an etched, intensified version, a diagram of what I once was, overlaid with something else. The air around me felt different now. Charged, I could almost feel reality thinning, stretching. The signal wasn't just influencing me, it was changing me, resculpting my very essence. I was no longer an observer. My old self, the rational, logical Raj, was dissolving, a thin film peeling away from a new, terrifyingly aware being. It was the peace of understanding, of belonging to something immeasurably larger than myself. But what was the cost of this belonging? I reached out a hand, not to the glass, but to the air itself. It shimmered just for a moment, a subtle distortion that only I could perceive. The hum deepened, resonating not just in my bones, but in the very space between my atoms. The purple light intensified, burning brighter, hotter, yet without heat. I felt a surge, a rush of pure, undiluted information flooding my mind, not in words or images, but in pure, unadulterated knowing. It was the language of the cosmos, the silent discourse of entities that predate time, and I, Raj, was finally fluent. The universe was not empty, it was teeming with ancient, slumbering minds, and I had just woken one. Or perhaps it had woken me. What would I do with this terrible, beautiful knowledge? The hum. My teeth ached from the constant tremor, a deep, bone-rattling thrum that burrowed into my marrow. My vision blurred at the edges, the familiar gray of the walls in the control room seeming to ripple, like heat haze over asphalt. I tried to steady myself against a console, my fingers sinking slightly into the cool metal, or so it felt. No, that couldn't be right. Metal doesn't yield like that. I pulled my hand back, a faint, sticky residue clinging to my fingertips. It smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something ancient and metallic, like blood left on a forgotten blade for eons. My stomach clenched, a cold knot forming in my gut. What was I touching? The hum intensified, no longer just a vibration but a presence. It wasn't in the room, it was the room. It was me. My own thoughts felt like echoes in a much larger alien chamber. I could feel the individual cells in my body responding, buzzing, resonating with a frequency that was entirely wrong, entirely other. My skin prickled, not with goosebumps, but with an internal static, as if my very atoms were being rearranged, nudged into a different, more harmonious alignment with this pervasive drone. I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my lips. My vocal cords merely vibrated in a grotesque parody of speech, contributing to the omnipresent hum. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen weight that pressed down on my chest, making each shallow gasp a struggle. The light panels overhead, which had flickered erratically for days, now pulsed with a sickly purple luminescence. It wasn't light, not truly. It was a visible manifestation of the signal, a shimmering, viscous glow that seeped into every corner, distorting the very concept of shadow. Where the light touched, surfaces seemed to soften, to lose their rigid geometry. The sharp angles of the equipment blurred, the straight lines of the wall panels began to undulate. But the purple light seeped through, painting the inside of my skull with impossible, shifting patterns. When I opened my eyes again, the transformation had deepened. The radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was no longer a structure built by human hands. The walls rippled like disturbed water, not solid, but fluid, shifting, revealing glimpses of something vast and utterly alien beneath. It was as if the plaster and concrete were merely a thin, fragile veil, now tearing apart to reveal the true fabric of existence. And that fabric was not stone, nor steel, nor empty space. It was the hum. It was the signal. It was it. The console before me had softened into a gelatinous mass, its buttons and screens dissolving into swirling vortices of purple and gray. But it wasn't just my reflection. Within the swirling depths, I saw other things. Not images, but impressions. Shapes that defied earthly geometry, colors that had no names. They were fleeting, vast, and ancient beyond comprehension. My mind screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the hum, absorbed into the greater, overriding vibration. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak, my balance gone. The floor beneath my feet felt like shifting sand, then like taut membrane, then like nothing at all. I was falling, but not through space. I was falling through reality. The air rushed past me, not wind, but the displacement of existence itself. The purple light pulsed faster, brighter, enveloping everything. I was no longer in a room. I was in the signal. It was teeming with a presence so immense, so utterly indifferent that my human understanding shattered like brittle glass. It wasn't a creature with eyes or limbs. It was the very absence of those things, yet it perceived. It wasn't a mind, but it thought in patterns that unwound the very concept of thought. It was the deep, elder truth that slept between the stars, and it had woken, and I, Raj, was its first unwitting witness. My perception of reality, of time, of self, unspooled like a cheap ribbon. Was I still Raj, or was I merely a fleeting echo in the vast, resonant cavity of its awakening? The world outside the radio telescope installation, signal received not from space, was gone, or rather it had been remade. It wasn't destruction, but repurposing. The familiar world had simply been absorbed, its matter and energy rewoven into a new tapestry, one that hummed with the same terrible, pervasive frequency. My heart beat, but it was out of sync with my body, a frantic, desperate rhythm trying to assert itself against the cosmic pulse. My eyes, though they saw nothing recognizable, perceived everything, and I was part of it now, a tiny, insignificant node in its boundless, terrible consciousness. What was left of Raj, if anything, to truly witness this new dawn?